Smoke rose from the broken ground. As the last ships flew away into the sky, the air was hot and full of dust and fire. Weapons lay silent, and bodies were still. The war had moved to another place. But not everyone had left. She was lying there between the ruins of metal and stone, an alien girl with silver skin and dark green hair. Her eyes were open, but empty. Her body was cut and burned. Her people had run without her. She was too weak to move, and too tired to speak. She had tried to call them, but they had not listened. She was not a soldier. They said she was not strong. They said she was just a waste of space, they said. So they left her in the dust. The sound of boots crunched near her head. She blinked slowly, trying to see a shadow moved over her. Tall and solid, and human Sergeant Jack Weller looked down at her with careful eyes. His rifle was ready, and his armor was scratched. He had seen many strange things in this war, but this was new. A young alien girl left behind by her own army. He knelt beside her and checked her wounds. They were bad, but not hopeless. He touched his radio and called his team. They told him to keep moving. No time for charity, they said. No room for weakness. They said leave her and finish the sweep. They said, but Jack did not move. The girl looked up at him with slow, blinking eyes. She did not beg. She did not cry. She had already accepted that she would die there. Along Jack reached into his pack and pulled out a water tube. He lifted her head gently and let the water touch her lips. She drank slowly. Her voice was dry and low as she whispered a word in her own tongue. Then she passed out. Again Jack looked around at the empty ruins. This place was dead, but she was still breathing, and something deep inside him said that was enough. He picked her up carefully. She was light and small. She did not resist. His team was calling again. The captain's voice came through, clear: enemy forces are moving back and get to the fallback point. Now Jack looked at the girl in his arms. He looked at the sky above. He looked at the broken world around him. And he started walking the other way. He moved fast between walls and wrecks. Every step was a risk. Every corner could hide death. But he kept going. She coughed. Once her eyes opened again, she looked at him with weak confusion. Why are you helping me?" Jack did not answer. He just kept walking behind them in the distance. A drone flew low. Its camera turned and blinked red. Jack ducked under a broken roof and held his breath. The girl clung to him with weak fingers. The drone passed and did not see them. He found a small shelter under a collapsed bunker. It was dark and full of dust, but it was safe for now. He set her down gently and checked her wounds again. He used a human med pack to stop the bleeding. He gave her more water and a food tablet. She looked at it with confusion. He broke it in half and placed it in her mouth. She chewed slowly. She was trying to speak, but her voice was weak. Jack sat beside her and waited outside. The wind blew hard. Distant engines roared. Something was coming. He checked his map. They were far from the safe zone. Too far to make it on foot in time. But he would not leave her. Not now. She whispered something again. He leaned close. Her name was Lura. He said it back to her, and she smiled for just a moment. Then her eyes closed again. The radio crackled in his ear. Orders were clear. Leave the ruins. Join the others. Forget what you saw. Jack turned it off. He looked down at the girl lying beside him. She was breathing slowly. She had been left to die, but he was not going to walk away even in war, even in this broken world. Some things still mattered on, so he stayed beside a girl left in the dust of war, waiting for a way out while danger crept closer, and the stars above watched in silence. Asterisk, the radio screamed in Jack's ear again, telling him to fall back now, to move fast, to leave everything behind and save himself. But Jack did not move because the alien girl was still breathing, and he had made a choice. Smoke still filled the air, and broken ships burned in the distance as Jack held Lura close to his chest and ran through the ruins, like a ghost moving between death and silence, with no one to help and nowhere to go but forward. Each step was a risk and every shadow was a threat, because enemy scouts had returned to search the area, and Jack knew they would not care who she was or what she had done or not done, because to them she was just a target. Lura whispered something weak and soft, but he could not understand her words, so he just said, "Easy now, stay with me." Just a little longer as he reached the edge of the broken city and spotted a half-collapsed structure hidden by twisted metal and fire walls. He pushed inside and found a dark bunker with one working door and no sign of motion inside. So he set her down gently on the floor and checked her wounds, again using the last of his medical gel to close the deepest cuts while her skin twitched under his touch, but she did not pull away. Jack sat back against the wall, breathing hard and listening for movement outside, while his heart pounded like a drum in his chest, and his mind raced through old memories of war and loss and moments when he had watched good people die just because no one cared enough to try. He remembered his first mission, where a friend had been wounded, and command said to leave him, and he had listened that time and still saw his face in dreams, and hated himself for it. So now, when he looked at Lura, he saw something familiar, something he could not walk away from again. Lura opened her eyes slowly and blinked at him with confusion, then fear, then something softer as she tried to speak. Again, her voice barely a breath as she asked, "Why are you doing this?" And Jack could not answer right away, because he was not sure himself. He said finally, "Maybe because someone has to, maybe because I know how it feels to be left behind, maybe because I believe you deserve better." And she looked at him as if trying to understand something she had never heard before, something that did not exist in her world. The radio hissed again, and this time it was his captain shouting, "Jack, where are you? Why are you not responding? The area is hot. Extraction is moving now. Repeat, extraction is moving now. You have 10 minutes, or we leave without you." Jack turned the volume down and looked at Lura, then looked at the door, and then looked at the sky through a crack in the ceiling, and knew he could not leave her, not now, not like this. He stood up and pulled his gear tighter around his body, then lifted her once more, her arms hanging weakly around his neck, as he stepped back into the dead streets of the broken city, where every step could be his last, and every breath could be his final one. He followed the alleys and the shadows, using the map in his head and the instincts that had kept him alive. This long moving fast and quiet, and never stopping, even as his legs burned, and his back ached and his throat begged for water. Laura rested her head on his shoulder, and whispered again. So soft he almost missed it, she said, "I was told humans were cruel, that they only save their own, that they take and never give." And Jack smiled without joy, and said, "Yeah, I heard the same about youth." They moved through a broken factory filled with the bones of old machines and flickering lights, and found a path that led to the old subway tunnels, where the dust was thick but the air was still, and no one followed them there, at least not yet. Jack set her down again and gave her the last piece of food. He had then sat beside her, watching the tunnel mouth with tired eyes and a ready hand on his weapon, because even now they were not safe and might never. Lura looked at him and asked, "Do you think your people will help me, or shoot me?" And Jack did not lie. He said, "I do not know, but I will be with you no matter what." And somehow that made her smile, even through the pain. Sound of something moving echoed from the dark ahead, and Jack rose slowly, his weapon raised as lights flickered and a shape came into view, and he could not tell if it was friend or foe. Laura tried to sit up but fell back again, and Jack moved to stand between her and whatever came next, because he had made a promise, not with words but with actions, and he was not going to break it. The shape moved closer, and the light caught metal and armor and eyes that watched him without blinking, and Jack held his ground even as his hands shook, because fear was real, but so was duty. On as the silence grew, and the moment stretched into something sharp and deadly, he whispered to himself, "You are not alone, not this time, not ever again." The sky was burning behind them, as Jack pushed forward through the ruined subway tunnel, with Lura in his arms, and fire chasing their shadows like a hungry beast with no face and no mercy. The ground shook as bombs fell above and dust rained down from the ceiling in soft choking clouds, but Jack kept moving one step after another, holding her tightly as if letting go would mean the end of everything. Laura was barely conscious now, her head resting against his shoulder, and her breath shallow and slow, like a quiet whisper fading into silence, and Jack knew he had to find safety soon, or she would slip away before his eyes. His legs felt heavy like stone, and his back ached with every movement, but he would not stop. He could not stop, not after everything, not after choosing her over orders, not after seeing the fear in her eyes, and the trust that followed. He reached the end of the tunnel, and pushed open a broken gate, leading into the lower service chambers, where old machines slept, and the smell of rust and oil filled the air like forgotten stories of a dead world. Jack laid her down gently on a thick top, and checked her wounds again. The medjool had stopped the bleeding, but the heat from her skin warned him of infection, something deep and dangerous that could kill if left untreated. She opened her eyes for a moment, and whispered something in her native tongue, her voice shaking and soft as wind through dry leaves, and though he could not understand the words, he felt the meaning. Like a blade against his heart, he gave her water, and wiped the sweat from her forehead, speaking quietly, telling her to hold on just a little longer, because help was coming, even if he had to drag it from the stars. Himself, Jack pulled out his old communicator and sent a coded signal to an old contact, someone who owed him a favor from a mission long buried and forgotten by most except by those who still carried scars. The reply came faster than he expected, a voice speaking through static, asking what the price was, and Jack answered without hesitation, asking only for one thing: transport out for 2, no questions, no delays. The voice paused, then agreed, but warned him the pickup point was deep in no zone, where no laws ruled, and every step was a gamble, where trust was thin, and betrayal thick like blood on cold hands. Jack agreed, and ended the call, then turned to Lura, who now looked at him with tired eyes and asked, "Where are we going?" And he told her somewhere better than here. And that was all she needed to hear. He wrapped her in a thick cloak and prepared to move again, packing what little supplies they had, and listening to the distant sounds of footsteps echoing through the tunnels like whispers of coming danger. Moved slowly through the dark corridors of the undercity, passing machines older than time and walls marked with warnings from soldiers long gone and survivors who never saw the sun. Again at one point Lura asked him why he fought, why he risked so much for someone not from his world, and Jack said, "Maybe because I remember what it felt like to be left behind. Maybe because I still believe not all lives are weighed by what planet they come from." She did not speak after that, only watched him, with quiet wonder, as if seeing something she had never known before, something strange and strong and human. The tunnels opened into a large chamber where light poured through broken grates above, and old train shells stood like skeletons waiting for life to return, but none came, only silence and shadows. Jack checked the map in his helmet and marked the shortest path to the pickup point. Only 3 kilometers more, but full of danger and unknown threats, and still he pushed. On they climbed broken stairs and crossed bridges made of rusted steel, and at one point a drone flew overhead, scanning the ground below, but Jack pulled Lura beneath a pile of metal and held his breath until the sound faded into distance. She trembled in his arms, and he whispered, "You are safe. I promise," as his own heart pounded like thunder beneath armor and fear and will. The final stretch lay ahead, an open field of rubble and shattered buildings, where old wars had left nothing but bones and glass and memories. Too heavy to carry, Jack moved carefully, scanning every step and every sound, while Lura watched the sky as if it held the answers to questions she had never dared to ask. A ship appeared in the distance, low and quiet and dark, with no flag, no mark, only purpose and promise, and Jack felt hope rise like fire in his chest. They had almost made it. But fate was not done yet, because from behind the ruins came voices and boots and the sharp sound of weapons ready to kill. And Jack turned and saw them, 5 men in ragged armor with cruel smiles and greedy eyes, who saw Lura and knew she was valuable to someone somewhere, enough to trade, enough to sell. He stood tall and placed her gently behind him, raising his weapon and narrowing his eyes as they laughed and stepped forward, thinking him alone and tired and easy to break. But they had no idea who he was, or what he had already chosen, or what he was willing to become to protect one life left behind by all others. And as the ship drew closer and the wind rose and the moment burned, Jack spoke only 4 words that stopped the raiders. "Cold she is, not yours." The sky turned dark above the no zone as wind howled through the broken steel towers, and Jack stood with Lura hidden behind a wall of wreckage, waiting for the smuggler ship to land and take them away from everything there. Ship came slow and silent, black as night, with no lights and no sound, just the hiss of landing gear touching cracked stone and the low hum of old engines burning low fuel. Jack stepped forward with care, his weapon ready, his eyes sharp, his arm steady, as he held Lura close and walked out to greet the one man he thought he could trust in this broken galaxy. The smuggler was tall and thin, wrapped in layers of armor and cloth, with a half-metal face and eyes that never smiled. His name was Rook, and he once owed Jack his life. "You brought the package," Rook said, without warmth, and Jack nodded. "She is the one you said, no questions, and I kept my word. Now, keep yours." Rook smiled in a way that made Jack's gut twist, and then he gave a short whistle, and from behind the ship came 4 more figures, armed and armored, and not friendly. Jack moved fast, pulling Lura behind him, as the men spread out like wolves ready to strike, and Rook stepped closer with a hand out and a lie in his voice, saying, "It's just for safety. Jack, you know how it is." Jack's voice was ice as he said, "You sold us out," and Rook gave a slow nod. "Money talks, and promises fade. That goal's worth more than a debt." The hunters raised their weapons, and Jack fired first, hitting the ground near their feet to make them dive for cover. Then he threw a flash bomb that lit the air white and grabbed Lura and ran. They dove behind the ship, and Jack pulled her through a small hatch into the cargo bay, locking it from the inside as he shouted at the ship's AI to lift off now. But the AI did not listen, because the main control was locked by Rook, and the engines stayed dead while the hunters pounded on the door and shouted threats and promises. Lura was shaking but silent, her eyes wide with fear, as Jack checked every exit and tried to think fast, with the clock ticking and the trap closing tight. Found a side panel loose and pulled it open, crawling inside and dragging Lura with him through narrow metal tunnels that smelled of smoke and rust, and old secrets. Voices echoed behind them, boots on steel, hands on metal, gunshots in the air, and Jack kept moving, never stopping, never looking back, because he knew what waited if he did. Lura whispered something, but he only said, "Keep going, we're not done yet," and she nodded her head and trusted him. Again without words they reached the back of the ship and found a service lift that dropped into the old freight tunnel below the landing zone, dark and deep, and not on any map. Jack used a cutter to break the lock, and they dropped down into blackness, landing hard on cold stone. As the tunnel stretched ahead like the throat of a beast, the sound of the ship faded above, as Rook cursed and searched, but Jack and Lura were gone ghosts, once more hiding in the places where light dared not follow. They walked for a long time, or maybe it just felt long as silence wrapped around them like a blanket too heavy to lift, and fear walked beside them with every step. Laura spoke softly, asking if he had known this would happen, and Jack said, "I hoped not, but I'm never surprised anymore. Not in this war, not in this galaxy." She touched his hand for just a moment, and said, "Thank you." And he said, "Don't thank me yet. We're still in the lion's mouth, and it's hungry." The tunnel led to a wide cavern filled with broken ships and lost tech, a graveyard of machines and dreams, and Jack found an old scout vehicle, half buried in dust and wire. He opened the hatch and smiled for the first time in days, because it still had power and still could run, if just for a short time, enough to get them out of reach. Laura climbed inside and sat close to him as the engine wind and lights blinked and the vehicle roared to life. Like a sleeping beast waking for one last run, they burst through the far wall into open air, and dust flew around them as the wind hit their faces and the sun broke through clouds like hope through pain. Behind them, the ship rose again, and Rook's hunters spotted them and gave chase on bikes and drones with weapons hot and orders clear. Jack pushed the speed higher, gripping the wheel tight and watching the path ahead with eyes full of fire, and Willa's Lura held on and watched the sky grow brighter. Shots flew past them, sparks danced on metal, and the sound of war rose again, but Jack never slowed, never turned, never gave up, because he had one goal, and only one: get her to safety, whatever it takes, however it ends, wherever it leads him. As the city edge came into view, and the horizon stretched wide and free, Jack knew the game had changed again, but his choice had not. He had saved her once, and he would do it again, even if the whole galaxy stood in his way. The desert wind blew hot across the broken land as the sun dropped behind the jagged hills, and Jack dragged the scout vehicle under a rock ledge with smoke rising from its back and fuel almost gone, and no help in sight. He carried Lura into the shade and laid her down gently on a flat piece of stone, then checked her wounds again. Her skin pale and her breath slow, and her fever worse than before, with sweat soaking her clothes and her hands shaking. The chase had ended hours ago. But not the danger, because now the worst enemy was time and sickness, and the quiet that came when hope started to fade and nothing made sense except the person beside. Jack looked at her face and saw something he could not explain, something soft and brave and broken all at once, and he remembered the first time he saw her lying alone in the dust as her people flew away without a word. He reached into his pack and found only one injector left, filled with med serum, designed for humans, and maybe deadly to aliens, but it was the only thing he had, and she would not survive the night without it. His fingers shook as he held it, and his heart pounded like a drum, because this was not a choice he had trained for, not a command from above. Just one man holding one life in his hands, with no way to know what would happen. He sat beside her, and spoke softly like a story told to the wind, saying, "I know this might hurt you, and I know you might hate me, but I can't watch you die, not after everything, not after what we've been through." Laura opened her eyes just a little and looked at him with something close to trust, and her lips moved, but no sound came, and Jack knew she was saying, "It's okay," even if she was not sure herself. He pressed the injector to her arm, and closed his eyes and pulled the trigger, as the serum flowed into her body, and the future hung on a knife edge, between life and death, between mercy and mistake. For a moment nothing changed, then her body tensed and she gasped for air, and her back arched like fire burned inside her veins, and Jack held her close and whispered, "You're not alone, not now, not ever." Minutes passed like hours, and the fever broke, and her breathing slowed, and her hands stopped shaking, and Jack felt tears on his face, and did not care, because she was still with him, and that was enough. The stars came out slowly, one by one, like tiny lights watching from above, and the desert grew quiet and cold as night settled around them like a dark blanket filled with questions and memories. Jack built a small fire with scrap and wire, and sat beside her holding a pistol in one hand and a blanket in the other, watching shadows move across the sand, and waiting for anything that might come. Laura stirred in her sleep, and murmured his name, not with fear, but with peace, and Jack smiled a tired smile, and whispered back, "I'm here, just rest, we're safe." For now he did not sleep that night, his mind too full, and his body too tired to close his eyes and let go. So he stayed awake and watched the fire, and thought about the war, and the people he had lost, and the promises he had broken. Morning came with red light on the hills, and the sound of engines far away, maybe rescue, maybe hunters, maybe something else, but Jack was ready for anything, because he had made his choice, and would not turn back. Lura woke with strength in her eyes, and color in her face, and she sat up slowly, and touched his arm, and asked softly, "Did you stay with me all night?" And he nodded once, and said, "I always will." She looked at the sky, and then at him, and said, "My people would not understand this, they would call it weakness. But I think it's the strongest thing I've ever seen." Jack helped her to her feet, and packed their things. And they started walking toward the edge of the rocks, where the signal beacon had been left the night before, blinking like a lighthouse. In the storm each step was hard, but she did not fall, and he did not let her walk alone, always by her side, always watching, always ready to carry her again, if she needed it. They reached the beacon, just as a ship appeared, in the distance, small and silver with human markings, and Jack raised his flare, and fired it into the sky, as Lura leaned on him with tired eyes and a steady heart. The ship landed, and a man in armor stepped out with a scanner in one hand, and a rifle in the other, and asked, "Who is she, and why is she with you?" And Jack stood tall, and said, "She's under my protection, and that's all you need to know." The man looked at Lura, then back at Jack, and saw something in his eyes, something real, and strong, and full of fire, and, after a pause, he nodded, and waved them aboard. As they stepped into the ship, Lura looked back one last time, at the desert that had tried to take her, and then forward to whatever came next, and Jack followed her without fear, because he had already made the hardest choice, the choice to care when no one else would. Asterisk. The ship shook as it rose into the clouds, with engines roaring, and metal creaking under stress, while Lura sat beside Jack, watching him sleep. At last, his face calm but pale, and his breath slow and heavy from the wounds he had hidden too long. He had not said a word since they boarded, only gave her a tired smile, and passed out in his seat, and now she could see the bandage on his side, dark with fresh blood, and knew something was wrong. The pilot said nothing, just kept flying toward the border outpost, where safety waited, but it was still hours away, and Lura felt fear crawl into her chest, like cold fingers wrapping around her heart. She touched Jack's hand and whispered his name, but he did not stir, and his skin felt warm and dry like fire under the surface, and her mind spun with memories of his voice, his strength, and the way he had carried her through ruin and fire. Now it was her turn to carry him, and she would not fail him, not now, not after all he had done, not after the way he had looked at her like she mattered. The ship dropped low as alarms began to sound, and red lights flashed across the walls, and the pilot shouted, "We are being followed. Prepare for contact, prepare for fight." Lura stood with shaking legs, and looked out the window, where small black shapes flew fast toward them, fast, and armed and ready to take her back, or kill her. She turned to Jack, and saw his eyes open for a second, saw the pain in them, and the warning, and the fear. Then he closed them again, and whispered one word, "Gunchi." Searched his pack, and found the weapon heavy and cold, with lights on the side, and a grip that fit her hand just enough, and she remembered how he once showed her to hold it, how to breathe, how to amp. The ship jolted as the enemy hit the hull with sharp noise like claws scraping steel, and the pilot screamed, "They are boarding, they are!" Inside, Lura moved fast, pulling Jack behind the seats, and laying him down with care, then turned toward the door, where the sounds grew louder, and shadows moved closer step by step. She took a deep breath, and raised the gun, her fingers tight, her heart louder than the alarms, her mind full of his voice, saying, "You can do this." The first shape came through the door, fast and tall, with armor like bones, and eyes that glowed red, and Lura fired once, and missed, and fired again, and the shot hit the chest, and the shape fell. Another came behind it, and she stepped left, and fired again, and the second one fell too. But more kept coming, and her hands began to shake, and tears touched her eyes, but she did not stop. She thought of the day she was left to die, and the moment Jack chose her, and the promise he made without words, and she screamed at the enemy, "You will not take him." The gun clicked empty, and she dropped it, grabbed a metal rod, and stood ready to fight as one more shape stepped inside. But then a second voice filled the air, loud and clear enough. "Stand down. This ship is claimed by command. This girl is protected under Soldier Bond." The enemy paused, then pulled back, and the pilot locked the door, and flew higher into the clouds, as silence returned, broken only by the sound of wind and breath. Dropped to her knees beside Jack, and touched his face, saying, "It is over. We are safe now. Please stay. Please fight." He opened his eyes slowly, and smiled a small smile, and said, "I knew you could do it." And she laughed through her tears, and held his hand as the stars filled the windows. They reached the outpost 2 hours later, a small base on the edge of space, with walls of steel and guards in black armor. who stared as Lura carried Jack off the ship step by step. Without fear, doctors came and took him away, and she stood in the hall, alone, covered in dust and blood, holding the empty gun, and waiting for someone to speak. A woman in a captain's coat came and asked, "Who are you?" And Lura said, "I am the one he saved. I am the one he chose." And the captain nodded and said, "Then you are under our care days past." And Jack healed slowly with machines and medicine, and silence between moments of pain, but every time he opened his eyes, Lura was there beside him, telling him stories from her world and feeding him water with gentle hands. One night he asked her, "Why did you stay? Why did you fight?" And she said, "Because you did first, because no one ever did for me until you." He looked at her like she was the only star left in the sky, and said then, "I am glad I did." And she smiled and said, "Me too." Outside, the war still burned across worlds, and skies still tore with fire, and fleets still fought over dust. But in that small room, on that small base, something stronger than war had begun. It had started with one girl, one gun, and a soldier who would not walk away. The sky over the border base was blue with thin white clouds drifting above steel towers and landing pads, and Lura stood beside Jack as the wind touched her face, and the sound of distant engines filled the air like echoes of battles not yet finished. Had healed slowly, but his steps were strong again, and his eyes clear with that same fire that once looked down at her on the battlefield, when she had nothing left but breath and fear and silence. Now they stood together, watching as a new ship arrived. A transport that would take them away from the war zone to a place where no orders would chase them, no commanders would shout, and no one would ever try to sell her. For credits again, Lura wore human clothes, now soft gray and brown, with a small badge that marked her as protected by service law under the name of Sergeant Jack Weller, and though the badge was small, the meaning behind it was heavy. She turned to him and asked, "Are you sure we can leave now?" And he nodded without words, because they had done enough. They had fought hard, they had bled, they had survived, and now they had earned their peace. But peace was never easy, not in a galaxy where politics ran deeper than honor and secrets traveled faster than ships, because even now, eyes were watching, and names were whispered in dark places, where mercy was called weaknesses. The ship door opened, a soldier ran toward them, his breath short, and his voice louder than the engines, yelling, "Stop! You cannot take her, she is not cleared. By command she is still listed as alien intelligence." Jack stepped forward, and his hand touched his badge, and his eyes met the young man's without blinking, and he said, "She is under my bond, she is under my protection, and no paper can break what I swore with my life." The young soldier froze, unsure, afraid of the fire in Jack's voice, and the history in his eyes, and slowly stepped back as the officer from earlier walked up with a calm face and a file in her hand. She said, "The council has questions. They want to know why you broke orders, why you risked everything, why you saved someone who was marked as waste by her own." King Jack said, "I did it because no one else would, and if that is a crime, then write it down and stamp it in fire, but do not try to take her again, because I will not stand by." The officer stared at him for a long moment, then at Lura, who stood quiet and strong by his side, and after a breath she closed the file and said, "I see no traitors here, only survivors, and we need more of them." She turned and walked away, and the young soldier followed, and Jack let out a breath he had held too long, as Lura took his hand and squeezed it with warmth and pride. They boarded the ship and found seats by the window, and as the engines rose and the base grew small behind them, Jack felt something shift inside, like a chain breaking or a door opening. Lura leaned her head on his shoulder and said, "You never let go, not even when it was easy." And he said, "I could not, because when I looked at you, I saw someone who still believed, someone who still hoped, even if she did not know it." Yet she smiled and closed her eyes, and he watched the stars appear one by one, like tiny promises floating in the dark, waiting to be kept. Their journey took them far across quiet sectors, through old space lanes and hidden ports, where no one asked questions, and everyone had stories written in scars and silence. They found a place on a green world, with tall trees and calm lakes, where the war felt like a dream, and no one cared what badge you wore, or what blood ran in your veins. Jack built a home with his own hands, with help from old friends and quiet neighbors, and Laura planted flowers that grew in spiral shapes from her world, with colors that made the sky look brighter. They lived simple days, with shared meals and long walks, and stories told under the stars, where laughter came easy, and fear was just a shadow that never touched them again. Sometimes ships would pass overhead, and Jack would pause and watch with old soldier eyes. But Lura would touch his arm and say, "We are safe," and he would believe her. Every time. One night she asked him if he ever missed the war, and he said, "I miss the people, not the fire." And she said, "I understand, because I lost many before you, and I do not want to lose again." He promised her then, with no ring, no paper, just words spoken under moonlight, that he would never leave her, that he would stay as long as she wanted, and longer if needed. Passed, and no one came for them, no council, no hunters, no old ghosts, just the wind and the rain, and the voices of birds singing in trees. They had planted together, and one day, a child ran through the tall grass with bright eyes and curious hands, and both human and alien in her smile, and Jack lifted her high and laughed. Like a man who had never known war. Laura watched from the porch, her eyes full of peace and wonder, and whispered he did not walk away, and because of that, everything changed. Forever.